Welcome, or good evening if you're joining us from Ireland. My name is Christian Dupont. I'm the director of the John J. Burns Library for Rare Books Special Collections and Archive, and you're joining us live from our lecture hall here. We do have a few people, including family members. Selena, welcome. Fergal's wife is here. Your daughters are off at school. We're so glad to have the family here as our visiting scholars in residence this entire semester at Boston College. The Burns Visiting Scholars Program in Irish Studies goes back to the early 90s. And Fergal, you are our 42nd scholar. So we're delighted here to have you and all of you online. Thank you for those of you who have to endure a little patience in repointing your link to come and join us live here. Thank you for that. And at this point, I'm going to ask Rob Savage, as the director of our Irish Studies program here at Boston College, to give Fergal a more proper introduction and welcome. And for those of you who are joining line, look at the chat function. You can put questions in during the course of the talk. Fergal's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to come back at the end to help mediate questions, especially for those of you online. We will finish up at the top of the hour, and then it will continue a little discussion with those of us who are here in the room together. So with that, again, thank you, and Rob?
Thank you, Christian. I'm delighted to welcome Fergal McGarry to the Burns. It's been wonderful to have him here as the Burns scholar. Fergal McGarry is Professor of Modern Irish History at Queen's University, Belfast. He is one of Ireland's leading historians, having written 4 monographs and edited 7 volumes. His work is truly exceptional in its exploration of the complexities of Irish political, social, and cultural history. His research was recognized in 2019 when he was elected to the Royal Irish Academy. Professor McGarry's earlier work includes groundbreaking studies of Ireland and its impact, or the impact of the Spanish Civil War. He completed 2 compelling biographies. One of the biographies is of the Republican socialist Frank Ryan, the other of the fascist Owen O'Duffy. These books engage the reader by addressing the lives of these controversial and rather remarkable men, but also because they explore Ireland's interwar radicalism and engage with this material in a European context. His more recent research focuses on the Irish Revolution and the cultural and political revival from which it emerged. These publications include The Rising, as well as The Abbey Rebels of 1916, A Lost Revolution. Both of these books emerged during Ireland's commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Irish Revolution, and have seen Fergal invited to speak throughout Europe, the United States, and Asia. Throughout his career, his work has demonstrated a deep interest in making history public by exploring how the past is represented in commemoration, historical film, and in museums. Professor McGarry enjoys a well-deserved reputation for successful grant writing and is known for innovative collaboration with universities across the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the United States. He led 2 major Arts and Humanities Research Council projects on film and history, and is currently the principal investigator of an AHRC-funded project, A Global History of the Irish Revolution. Indeed, the Global History Project is a collaboration with the University of Edinburgh, Boston College, as well as Queen's University in Belfast. It concludes with an international conference that will be held here at Chestnut Hill next year. As the Burns scholar this semester, Fergal is currently writing a book assessing Irish anxieties about modernity in an interwar European context. His lecture today, Communism, Sex, and All That Jazz, the Struggle Against Modernity in Interwar Ireland, is drawn from this, his most recent research. Fergal.
Thanks very much, Rob, for that very generous introduction, which I struggled to live up to, and thanks also, Christian. So it's a great pleasure to speak to you from the impressive surroundings of the Burns Library. I'd like to thank the Irish Studies program at Boston College for inviting me to take up residence as Burns scholar. And it's a real honor to follow in the footsteps of so many distinguished Burns scholars before me. I'm grateful to the staff at Boston College, particularly Rob Savage, and Christian DuPont for their hospitality since I've arrived, and also for organizing this event. And it's great to have a small, select audience present here today, which is hopefully a sign of things to come as we return slowly to normality. So, communism, sex, and jazz aren't the first things that spring to mind when we think of De Valera's Ireland. The remarkable scenes of piety when the Eucharistic Congress transformed Dublin into an open-air cathedral in 1932 much better evoke the popular memory of this era. But anyone who spent much time reading contemporary press reports, the bishop's Lenten pastorals, or government committee reports will be aware of the preoccupation with dance halls, cinema, evil literature, atheistic communism, and the spectre of modernity frequently identified at the root of these pernicious influences. Although many scholars have noted the striking gap between this alarmist rhetoric and the more prosaic lived experiences of the times, with many young people finding occasions of sin disappointingly thin on the ground in rural Ireland, there's been comparatively little analysis by historians of the significance of this discourse. And in my own work on Irish responses to the Spanish Civil War, I sort of took the fervent anti-communism of the era as a given. In retrospect, focusing more on the emotional nature of this response, which I think is conveyed very well here in this close-up on the cover of my book of a young man crossing his arms at a Christian Front meeting. I think focusing more on understanding the emotional force and appeal of the response to Spain might have sharpened my analysis somewhat. And so that's an area which I'm returning to now in my present research. And it's only really recently that the history of emotions is beginning to receive attention from Irish historians, scholars such as Cuiva Nick Dovade. Perhaps the most important cultural work perhaps the most important scholarly work to probe how the cultural climate shaped lived experiences during the Irish Free State is the scholarship on gender and sexuality, including studies by academics such as Maria Luddy, Lindsay Erner Byrne, and James Smith of Boston College. James Smith's work on the nation's architecture of containment embodied by repressive institutions such as the Magdalen laundries. But to my mind, we still lack in Irish historiography the equivalent of a broader cultural study, something like Richard Overy's The Morbid Age, which seeks to explain the deep pessimism articulated by interwar intellectual elites and authority figures about what they genuinely perceived as a crisis of civilization. And in Overy's book, we see how this very bleak assessment transcends political borders, with, for example, many on the left and on the liberal side also articulating very pessimistic views of political changes. So although post-war conservatives everywhere worried about the impact of modern culture, technology, moral degeneration, the destabilization of gender roles, and the frightening demands of new status ideologies, there remains a tendency, I think, to approach these themes as explicable in terms of distinctively Irish factors, such as the post-Civil War crisis of legitimacy and the resulting church-state alliance to restore the social and political order. But if we step back and consider Irish responses in comparative terms, we might see Catholicism and cultural nationalism less as causes of this reaction, as factors shaping how a wider unease with modernity was articulated within Ireland. So I want to suggest today that the popular appeal of anti-modern cultural movements deserves more attention. And this is not because of what they achieved. Both Catholic intellectuals and cultural nationalists failed in their ambition to construct a distinctively Irish society and state, one that could hold at bay the drift towards secular materialism that they so vociferously denounced beyond Irish borders. And I think this question of why the popular desire for a Catholic Irish Ireland did not translate into more concrete political or state forms, as occurred elsewhere in Europe, deserves more attention than it's received. The importance of anti-modern discourse, I want to argue today, lies more in how it facilitated the formation and projection of an Irish national identity, and how this process rested on a powerful ideological consensus that marginalized alternative conceptions of state, society, and politics. Tom Garvin, for example, uses the phrase preventing the future, which I think very aptly conveys this, the force of this kind of narrowing of cultural and political thought. And what made this consensus formidable was that it rested both on top-down impulses identified with the church-state nexus, which we're now pretty familiar with, but also popular support for the idea of Ireland as a uniquely spiritual nation with a particular destiny. And I think the moral panics that I'm going to look at today offer insights into the structures of power in Ireland, and how these rested on discourses of respectability, which mobilized widely shared values about morality, gender, and nation. And in the book that I'm writing, I aim to explore the social mechanisms rather than the formal political structures which sustained this consensus: surveillance, self-censorship, exclusion, marginalization, and other pressures that narrowed mental horizons. So I think perhaps one shortcoming of our current historians' approaches is maybe a focus too much on the end results of those pressures in terms of legislation, which I'm going to argue wasn't always terribly impactful, rather than thinking more about the social consensus upon which that legislation emerged from. So in thinking about how anxieties about communism, sex, and jazz relate to the regulation of bodies, ideas, and space, which is really what I'm interested in, I think the story of Jimmy Gralton is a good place to start. Gralton was a radical Leitrim-born emigrant to the US who returned to Ireland in 1921, joining the IRA towards the end of the Republican struggle for independence. He also built a hall on his farm in the quiet townland of Effernagh. Run by a committee of Republicans, farmers, and trade unionists, the hall became a site for classes, dances, and land courts. And in the heady revolutionary atmosphere of 1921, the space for such radicalism existed. By the end of the Irish Civil War, as a conservative pro-treaty government and Catholic Church worked together to restore the social order, the window for revolutionary ideas had firmly closed. Gralton fled back to the US, where he remained active in communist circles until March 1932, when he returned to Leitrim to take over the family farm. As fate would have it, Gralton had returned at another politically defining moment. The election of Fianna Fáil, inheritors of the anti-treaty Republican tradition, had prompted both the resurgence of the IRA and a conservative backlash that ultimately led to the formation of the fascistic blue shirts. Sorry, running behind with my slides there. That's the hall, and this is some of the propaganda around the Red Scare that emerged in 1932, prompted by the election of Fianna Fáil with the support of the IRA. Gralton predictably threw himself into this revolutionary tumult. He joined Fianna Fáil, he re-enlisted in the IRA, he engaged in communist and agrarian activism, and reopened the Pierce Connolly Hall as a sort of revolutionary community centre, in his own words. But once again, the radical tide ebbed as Fianna Fáil made peace with church and state forces, and militant anti-communism gained ground, as it did across much of Europe from the early 1930s. Gralton's communism saw him expelled from Fianna Fáil, while local priests condemned his hall as a den of prostitution. On Christmas Eve 1932, the hall was burned down by the IRA, and soon after he was served with an order by the police for his deportation as an undesirable alien. After remaining on the run for around 5 months, Gralton achieved the distinction of becoming the only Irishman deported from Ireland. He returned to New York, where he remained a communist activist until his death in 1945. Now, some of the details of this rather sordid episode remain murky. Gralton's deportation file was lost or destroyed, but it's clear that church and state colluded to remove a subversive presence from Irish society. What should we make of Gralton's story? Luke Gibbons has suggested its significance lies in shattering the myth so assiduously cultivated by De Valera, which depicted rural Ireland as the authentic embodiment of communal national values. Riven by poverty, class tensions, emigration, and inter-republican conflict, rural Leitrim was no ideal Ireland. Gralton's story is also emblematic of Fianna Fáil's embrace of Catholic respectability and state authority over more radical models of struggle, a recurring trope in the history of Irish Republican movements. But Gralton's fate also poses another intriguing question. Why did jazz, communism, and dance halls, international emblems of interwar modernity, provoke such alarm in one of the most remote corners of Ireland? Perhaps in part because rural Leitrim was, in certain respects, as connected to the United States as it was to Dublin. A key feature of modernisation is the shift from rural to urban. For most Irish people, this meant emigration to New York, London, or Boston, rather than Dublin. And of all Irish counties, Leitrim had the highest intensity of post-famine emigration, and the largest proportion of this exodus found its way to America, to cities like New York, where Jimmy Gralton ended up. So in living between two worlds, America, with all its modernity, and the rural West, Gralton embodied the lived experiences of many Irish. Reverse migration ensured that Leitrim also had the heaviest concentration of returned Yanks, who, David Fitzpatrick has suggested, deserved to be considered as agents of cultural change. Quoting David, "There is a strong case for attributing the partial Americanization of Ireland not just to cultural invasion by movies or jazz, but to the cumulative impact of this human exodus." Gralton's activism, Fitzpatrick argues, may be seen as an attempt to graft American radicalism onto Irish nationalism, its failure reflecting the social and cultural gulf between rural and urban America. Though international migration created and sustained powerful transnational networks, Fitzpatrick argues, these often found themselves at odds with prevailing opinion in both Ireland and the countries of Irish settlement. And perhaps an uneasy awareness of these networks and transnational connections may account for the remarkable meeting which takes place also in Limerick on New Year's Day 1934, so shortly after Gralton's expulsion, when 3,000 people bearing banners with slogans such as "Down with Jazz" and "Out with Paganism" assembled in the small Leitrim town of Mohill to launch a crusade against jazz. This event was orchestrated by Father Peter Confrey, a Leitrim priest with a colourful line in apocalyptic rhetoric, who had persuaded the Gaelic League to support his campaign. Jazz dancing and music with its abominable rhythm was borrowed from Central Africa by a gang of wealthy Bolshevists in the USA to strike at Christian civilization throughout the world, he declared. It was up to the people to rise against this jazz, dance, and music as it was necessary to save their traditions and fate. It was the QAnon theory of its day. Now, the outlandish nature of this rhetoric and Confrey's very evident zeal wasn't sufficient to deter figures such as Cardinal MacRory, the Primate of All Ireland, Eamon de Valera, the President of the Executive Council, and Douglas Hyde, soon to be President of the Free State, or of Éire, from sending messages of support, praising Confrey's efforts to stamp out all-night dances and to revive Irish dances and the Irish language. And of course, there was nothing new about clerical opposition to dance halls. These were seen as poorly lit venues associated with drinking, all-night dancing, and more serious occasions of sin. But the jazz pearl added a new dimension because of the clearly foreign provenance of the music, and also because of its more intimate, closed couple dancing, whereas traditional Irish dancing involved very little physical contact between both sexes. And an insight into the anti-jazz campaign's appeal is provided by this poem written by a local auctioneer from pretty much the same region that the campaign emerged. Now, as I'm confident that this is the worst poem ever inflicted on a Burns audience, I'm going to confine myself to picking out some key themes rather than a detailed critical appraisal. And the key themes here are rendered in bold. So if we look at these references to Holy Ireland, to youth, to Russia, to slums, patriotism, young maidens puffing fags in the synagogues of Satan, appeals from the altar, and the restoration of Irish dignity, we can see how jazz, or the myth of jazz, embodies the full gamut of anxieties about modernity. It's all here. The fear of transnational cultural influences, communism, class divisions, urbanization, the spectre of moral, religious, and national degeneration. And I think perhaps most significantly, gender as the thread connecting these anxieties. And one of the most striking features of this campaign, and there's a very fine account by Cathal Brennan on the website, The Irish Story. One of the most striking features of the campaign that followed over the next months was the level of publicity and gender, the publicity and support it engendered, with newspaper editorials, county councils, boards of health, and Catholic and cultural nationalist organisations publicly backing its objectives. Indeed, few issues were more intensely debated throughout early 1934 than the question, what is jazz? Which pops up again and again and again in headlines in local newspapers. For some, jazz was defined by its syncopated, that is, its offbeat music. Others focused more on the sensual style of the dancing than music itself. For many, the impact of American culture on the fabric of local society was the key concern. A letter writer to the Longford Leader, for example, lamented how the young men of his parish, with the locks, sleeked hair, and dolls' faces, now spoke Yankee. It is, oh yeah, says you, in a big way, who's that dame? She is a swell looker. So pervasive was the impact of cinema and radio that it shaped not just dress and behavior, but patterns of speech. Jazz, the same writer complained, produced effeminate men and masculine women. The girl now who doesn't smoke is the exception rather than the rule. The more powder and paint, the better, and you will see as low a cut frock in Cullifad or Kilcoggy as you will see in Dublin. So you get a sense here of how jazz is bringing the urban to the rural. The most disturbing feature of the anti-jazz campaign was the centrality of racialized and racist discourse. The next slide, which I'm not going to read in full, contains offensive terminology, so just to be aware of that. But I've put it up to give a sense of how extensively racial tropes were deployed to construct an Irish national identity against an uncivilized other. Jazz was undisguised barbarism from savage lands, a product of Louisiana swamps and the dark interiors of other continents. And that idea of savagery and barbarism reappears again and again. And such language underpinned the idea of jazz as bound up with the sensual, threatening moral as well as cultural purity. But while jazz could be depicted as African, Black American, Jewish, or even Soviet in inspiration, anti-jazz rhetoric was framed within traditional nationalist discourses. Was it for jazz, dances, and foreign music, Father Comfrey asked his audiences, that Pearse gave his life that the soul of Ireland might be saved? Although what some priests described as the Los Angelization of Irish culture was increasingly understood as a greater threat than Anglicization, such Anglophobic rhetoric positioned anti-moral crusades as patriotic. And it's this convergence of patriotism and Catholic morality that I think is key to the appeal of anti-modern crusades. But although hostility to jazz was framed in cultural nationalist Catholic terms, the same underlying anxieties that produced moral panics and state repression across Europe's political, geographical, and linguistic borders was in action here. As Dina Guseneva argues, in jazz anxiety and the European fear of cultural change, jazz's ostentatiously non-European qualities made it a quintessential element for defining cultural frontiers. Due to its association with wartime cultural change, African primitivism, and sexuality, jazz personified in powerful emotional form the otherwise ambiguous threat associated with modernity. And in Ireland, as Eileen Hogan has observed, racialized and sexualized constructions of jazz music contributed to the construction of an idealized national identity, premised upon the idealization of a rural, sanitized, moral landscape. So she argues that the anti-jazz campaign, in a sense, fixed anti-modernity to ideas of the rural. And of course, in the process, fixed Irish identities to the rural also. Now, in practical terms, what did this campaign achieve? Is it worthwhile looking closely at the writings and speeches of zealots and cranks? Well, the campaign didn't achieve very much. As with similar campaigns in this period, it was undermined by the zeal of its leaders, who denounced Fianna Fáil ministers, the Gardaí, the GEA, and eventually even other priests for backsliding in the campaign against jazz. And the campaign grew to include all forms of modern dance, so any kind of dance that wasn't traditional Irish, with foxtrotters and waltzers publicly denounced. Having initially called on Catholics to break the windows of dance halls, Father Confrey urged his followers to blow up every hall where jazz is practiced. His advice, by and large, wasn't followed, as we might imagine. But the campaign did lead the government to stop the playing of jazz on the national broadcaster 2RN. It also spurned the state's ongoing efforts to bring dance halls under closer supervision, leading to the Public Dance Halls Act of 1935, a measure which shifted unlicensed dances into parochial halls, benefiting church and state in the form of ticket sales and taxes, but probably ironically undermining the traditional rural dance practices, such as dancing in the domestic space and at the crossroads. But whether this legislation and these kind of campaigns had much impact on people's behavior is very questionable. The Irish continued to flock to cinemas and dance halls, just as the far more draconian efforts of repressive regimes such as the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany to regulate moral behavior was also often ineffective. The anti-jazz campaign is more significant, I want to argue, for the light that it sheds on the pervasive pessimism about social change and the extent to which it reveals how the anxieties of cultural nationalists and religious conservatives centered on gender and sexuality. And it's to this theme that I want to turn to now. Fine Gael's Oliver J. Flanagan once declared there was no sex in Ireland before television. In fact, there was a remarkable amount of discussion of sex in interwar newspapers, particularly before the Censorship Act of 1931 came in. But it was almost entirely focused on sexuality as crime. Priests, judges, policemen, and other authority figures railed against the evils of prostitution, venereal disease, birth control, illegitimacy, and infanticide, and their concerns were echoed by a wide range of vigilance organizations, not all of them Catholic by any means, which pressed for urgent state action to stem what they saw as moral degeneration. Giving institutional form to these concerns in 1931, the Cumann na nGaedheal government established a committee of inquiry which produced what became known as the Carrigan Report. This commission was initially tasked with investigating whether new legislation was required to tackle juvenile prostitution. But the committee, which was composed of a judge, a Catholic and a Protestant cleric, a social worker, and a civil servant, heroically exceeded its brief by tackling the wider problem of sexual immorality. And much of the lurid and exaggerated testimony that it heard was provided by priests, social workers, Catholic organizations, and other concerned professionals who, unsurprisingly, articulated their own alarmist worldview. I'm kind of listing all of these figures together as if there was an agreed take on the moral problems that Ireland faced. And it's important to see that there was actually some distinctions in the testimony. For example, there was perhaps surprisingly quite a number of women who gave evidence, many of them coming from women's trade unions, from hospitals, from social workers. And their evidence was more focused on the need to recognize the reality of problems faced, for example, by the unmarried mother. But the general tenor of the committee and the general tenor of the evidence and the way in which that evidence was marshaled into the final report focused more on the idea of an alarmist worldview. And of course, we now know that sexual immorality in the form of the widespread sexual abuse of children was taking place on an appalling scale and was a huge national problem. And interestingly, we find several witnesses to the committee, including the Garda Commissioner, Owen O'Duffy, testifying to the reality and to the scale of child abuse. But it's clear that the committee's principal concern was what it described as public indecency, what we would now see from our 21st century perspective as much more trivial issues to do with concerns about culture and behavior. Father Flanagan, for example, testified that conduct that in other countries was confined to brothels is to be seen without hindrance on our public roads, recommending that the hands of the police and magistrates be made effective. Clerical witnesses testified that immorality was rampant in defiance of priests and police. And I quite like that combination phrase, priests and police. Quite a lot of the witnesses take it for granted that authority and that the bulwark against immoral behavior is that coalition between church and state. And of course, church and state were the same forces which had sought to restore order in 1922 when the hierarchy condemned anti-treaty Republicans. And the next joint pastoral, which occurs, is in 1931, and that extended support to the Free State government's spurious Red Scare, which identified the IRA and by implication Fianna Fáil as a threat to the public order against the background of the coming election campaign. So as I say, although more nuanced testimony was heard from female witnesses, the committee's conclusions were clear. And we can just read some of it here, I think, in the next page. So a slightly lengthy quote, but I think an important one. The testimony of all the witnesses, clerical, lay, and official, is striking in its unanimity that degeneration in the standard of social conduct has taken place in recent years. It is attributed primarily to the loss of parental control and responsibility during a period of general upheaval. And that's obviously a reference to the revolution, to the War of Independence and the Civil War. But in other countries, we find that same notion very much related to the impact of the First World War, which is not in the foreground here, I think. A period of general upheaval which has not been reversed since the revival of settled conditions. This is due largely to the introduction of new phases of popular amusement, which are the occasions of many abuses, baneful in their effect upon the community generally, and are the cause of the ruin of hundreds of young girls. The commercialized dance halls, picture houses of sorts, and the opportunities afforded by the misuse of motor cars for luring girls as the chief causes alleged for the present looseness. The cogency and unanimity of the evidence laid before us leave no doubt that gross offences are rife throughout the country. Frank recognition of this fact will create a state of healthy public opinion, helpful to the government in purging the state from these evils. So, what does this by now much analysed report tell us about attitudes to public morality in Ireland? Well, clearly it indicates the extent of anxiety felt by authority figures, as well as the clear assumption that immorality was bound up, perhaps synonymous even with the modern in all its forms, dance halls, evil literature, motor cars, movies. It all represented a flow of foreign filth threatening the purity of the nation, to adopt the rhetoric which one could read day after day in local newspapers. The report also makes clear the extent to which anxieties about sexual immorality were articulated in gendered terms. Women were the problem. And one finds prostitutes, promiscuous girls and unmarried mothers conflated in the rhetoric, all identified as culprits in the decline of immorality, the decline of morality. So if women were the problem, women were clearly also the solution. Oh, I'm missing a slide, I think. Yeah, sorry. The chastity of women, on which national purity depended, required not only the protection, but the policing of the female body. Underlying an often genuine concern to protect vulnerable women was the idea of sexuality as criminal behavior. The report, for example, described unmarried mothers in state institutions as girl offenders, who should be, quote, maintained apart from the other inmates, the decent, poor, and sick. And such language exemplifies what James Smith has described as the nation's architecture of containment. The idea that the immoral should not just be hidden from view, but quarantined from society. A belief that informed the attitudes and the frequently more ruthless policies of other interwar European states, which used the same or a more punitive architecture of prison camps and prisons and punitive facilities. Only in recent decades has the extent of abuse inflicted on vulnerable citizens in these institutions come to be widely understood. And the limitations of both the state and church's efforts to come to terms with their responsibility for this is evident from inadequate responses to these issues in the present day, not least the issue of the assigning of responsibility. And recently in Ireland there's been a controversy following the issuing of the latest report on the mother and child homes, in which, while the report itself is quite nuanced and detailed, the suggestion is made is that principal responsibility for the predicament that these women found themselves in, the principal responsibility lies with Irish society. It lies with the fathers who delivered these girls to the institutions. It lies with the families who acquiesced in this. The taking away of babies for adoptions was a process that also often involved the permission of the people incarcerated within these institutions. And while there's obviously something to this, I think it overlooks the extent to which power operated and how power, we shouldn't just understand the operation of power through legal rights and legislative frameworks, but to social taboos and how emotions such as shame operated through society. And I think that's where perhaps historians have more work to do to understand slightly more complex, to arrive at a more complex understanding of how power worked. But it should also be noted that many of the committee's recommendations were not actually implemented. A skeptical Department of Justice was far from persuaded that the testimony heard by the committee was objective or accurate, or that its punitive recommendations were practical. It suggested punishments such as flogging, for example. The tenor of the report also concerned the government. What implication might be drawn from the claim that an overwhelmingly Catholic country, 10 years on from independence, was marred in degeneracy? And while the committee's unpublished report was buried, its concerns, particularly about issues such as birth control, were less easily dismissed and influenced subsequent legislation. Even if their grassroots zeal discomfited both the government and hierarchy, the energetic campaigns by Catholic vigilance organizations, which created the social pressures that the government was responding to, and which led to a moral legislative framework that enshrined a pervasive and censorious paternalism, deserved closer scrutiny. One obvious question is what motivated these moral campaigns? Reflecting on the career of Bishop Brown of Galway, James Donnelly Jr. asked whether the hierarchy really believed that society was in crisis, or whether they felt the nature of Irish Catholicism required an authoritarian paternalism, or, more cynically, whether they exaggerated their concerns to justify and extend clerical power. The clerical response to the Spanish Civil War, marking the peak of popular Catholic anti-communism, suggests considerable opportunism at work. As in Spain a few years ago, there was a wave of liberalism passing over Ireland today, Bishop McGean warned in his Lenten pastoral. Who will be so rash as to prophesy what the situation may be here in Ireland in 10 years' time if we pursue the policy of drift? The remarkable emotional response triggered by Irish press coverage of anti-clerical violence in Spain allowed Catholic conservatives to move against left-wing, liberal and secular trends at home. But as with other moral campaigns, the practical consequences of these efforts were surprisingly limited. Despite wholeheartedly endorsing Franco, the Irish hierarchy kept its distance from the virulently xenophobic Irish Christian Front, while the bishop's demands for an explicitly Catholic foreign policy response to Spain were resisted by De Valera, indicating that some boundaries to episcopal influence existed. The aspiration to fashion a Catholic nation was more successfully achieved on the level of the cultural construction of a confessional identity for the new state, and in shaping social mores rather than political structures. The close partnership between church and state, which gave Irish churches, and not just the Catholic Church, considerable autonomy over health, education and welfare, as well as the weakness of civic society and its secular intelligentsia, left little space for the emergence of the explicitly Catholic political parties or Catholic forms of state, which emerged throughout much of interwar Europe. For Irish governments, the construction and projection of Ireland as a Catholic nation, particularly through the classic interwar device of the state-sponsored, state-orchestrated spectacle, enhanced the legitimacy and prestige of the state at home and abroad. So I suppose what I'm arguing is that Catholic anti-modern sentiment operated most effectively on the level of discourse and creating a kind of a shared identity rather than in terms of the political structures that a lot of these advocates wanted to see emerging from their worldview. Visitors to the 1932 Eucharistic Congress, for example, such as G.K. Chesterton, saw in Ireland the possibility of a modern democratic Catholic state that could resist the remorseless demands of secular modernity. And here in the wonderful Burns Library, which is full of fascinating connections, in particular about Irish-American relations and about the American view of Ireland, we can see in the papers of Father John E. Murphy, who is the Jesuit professor of Irish literature at Boston College, we can see exactly the same kind of enthusiasm as we find in Chesterton's writing for the idea of Ireland as a modern miracle, its devotion offering a lesson for the modern secular world. Now, of course, the limitations of this vision have become increasingly evident in recent decades. The corollary of the belief articulated by the Archbishop of Tuam that the future of the country is bound up with the dignity and purity of the women of Ireland was the emphasis placed on disciplining and controlling those who failed to conform to impossibly high standards. Although avoiding many of the excesses and abuses of statist regimes, partly due to the influence of Catholic social thought on De Valera and his constitution, independent Ireland was characterised by an illiberal, repressive culture which prioritised conformity over freedom and undermined civic virtue by elevating appearance over realities. In the long run, the relationship between church and state damaged both entities, as embattled liberal Catholic intellectuals such as Sean O'Phelan vainly argued at the time. So I'd like to end where I began. Why has Jimmy Gralton returned to haunt the national consciousness, and what significance might we draw from this return? Luke Gibbons suggested that Gralton's survival on the run, when he was sheltered by friends and family for 5 months, indicated an underground tradition of resistance to authority. And I think sometimes it could be said that historians have been too focused on what people were not allowed to do, or what these kind of moral campaigns, as the lived reality within Ireland. And this idea of an underground tradition of resistance to authority, I mean, much the same could be said about the survival and regeneration of the memory of Jimmy Gralton, which over the decades was preserved through family memory, local tradition, labor activism, and the work of writers, artists, playwrights, and local historians. So I won't go, time is running short, so I won't go through all of this genealogy, but it gives you a sense of the very different forms and the very different kind of ways and the chronology of how the memory of Gralton was preserved and subsequently revived after long periods when it was really just in the background, almost forgotten. Reflecting on the genealogy of these narratives, the film scholar Ruth Barton suggests that more than the persona of Jimmy Gralton, it's the dancehall that emerges as a type of lieu de mémoire, a place of memory embodying what has been lost. So although Gralton remains an elusive figure, his whole is invested with memory, becoming, in Ruth Barton's words, a kind of utopian space of what might have been in a history that otherwise allows for little nostalgia for the past. And watching Ken Loach's Jimmy's Hall, which I think is a fine film, it's difficult not to be struck by the gulf between the real Jimmy Gralton and his on-screen depiction as a young and handsome romantic hero. So what we find is that each narrator locates Gralton in the politics of their own times. If Ken Loach's The Wind That Shakes the Barley depicts a lost revolution, Jimmy's Hall is the story of the failed republic that followed from that what might have been of Irish history. And that idea of a lost revolution, I think, has emerged really strongly as a key theme of the decade of centenaries, which I think very appropriately focuses on reclaiming the memory of women and what women did and how women were erased from narratives for the many decades of early Irish independence. The chronology of Gralton remembrance also mirrors the gradual emergence of secular forces in Ireland, with intriguing figures popping up along the way. Launching Des Guckian's 1986 pamphlet, we find the writer John McGahern, who was dismissed from his teaching post on the order of Archbishop John McQuaid, describing Gralton as the victim of an insecure state and a colluding church. Although also Leitrim-born, McGahern had only recently discovered Gralton's story, something he attributed to the effectiveness of the conspiracy of silence and suppression around his name and life. And I think McGahern's remarks point to the capacity of storytelling, cultural memory, and it include historical writing in that storytelling to interrogate structures of power, albeit sometimes over very long periods of time. And in 2016, Michael D. Higgins quoted John McGahern's speech when, as President of Ireland, he unveiled a memorial to Gralton, which he saw as ending the accommodating and evasive silence around Gralton's deportation. Standing at the site where Gralton's Hall had been burned down, President Higgins publicly apologised on behalf of the people of Ireland for what he described as Gralton's wrong and indefensible deportation. Gralton's treatment, Higgins declared, was emblematic of a wider suppression of radical and emancipatory politics in the Ireland of the 1930s, a time when a moral panic was created, a whipped-up fear of communism, coupled with clerical dominance, sourced in authoritarianism rather than any spirituality, created an atmosphere of intolerance and oppression of the labour movement. So Gralton's emergence from forgetful remembrance, as Guy Biner has characterised a repression of inconvenient memories by society, reveals much about changing Irish identity, as the Irish morphed from the best Catholics in the world to a self-conscious, even occasionally smug, embrace of cosmopolitan liberalism. This transformation might be seen as Gralton's revenge, although there's much about Ireland's embrace of global capitalism, materialism, and economic inequality that would appall a communist revolutionary like Gralton. But the rapid end of Catholic Ireland might also suggest the bishops had been right all along. Popular piety provided only a flimsy barrier against secularism in a society open to foreign ideas and culture. The freedom to think and to read and to behave according to one's individual desires and tastes represented a threat to a form of Catholicism whose authority relied more on obedience and tradition than spiritual conviction. Where the clergy proved mistaken was in their timescale. The edifice of Catholic Ireland would not crack for over half a century after Gralton's deportation. Thanks.
Thank you, Fergal. We're looking for some questions that come in online, and in the meantime, we will take some from in the audience here. So, Father Rafferty, I'm going to walk over to you with our microphone so we can all hear you, even online.
So, Fergal, thank you very much indeed. It raises all sorts of interesting ideas. But a couple of points, if I may. You would concede that the crisis of modernity was not peculiar to Ireland. This is something happening in other countries as well, not least in Germany, once the fascists take over the Nazis. So the fear of transnational cultural influences is common in Europe. And indeed, this is all happening in the context where there's a feeling in European society that democracy is at an end. And therefore, there's the choice between communism on the one hand and fascism on the other. And obviously, Catholic Ireland is not going to go for communism. But I was struck by the fact you talked about reverse migration. And I'm wondering that, and although you say this is a sort of catalyst for the entrance of some aspects of modernity into Ireland, could it also not be interpreted as people escaping the influences of modernity in America, wanting something different? Not, in other words, a rejection of modernity. And then finally, if I may, if I understood you correctly, you said that anti-modernity remained at the level of rhetoric rather than the change in political structures. But I put to you perhaps that the 1937 Constitution was precisely the rejection of modernity, looking back to a culture of Ireland that was perhaps even at that stage passing away, so that one sees in the 37 Constitution precisely a political instantiation of the rejection of the modern.
Great, thank you very much, Oliver. Loads of really interesting points for me to deal with. In terms of reverse migration, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really considered that possibility. Reverse migration has been really kind of overlooked. I mean, for a long time, there's an assumption that there wasn't very much of it. And David Fitzpatrick isn't the first, but I think his book is the first major study of the phenomenon of reverse migration. And I was struck by, how much there is and potentially what kind of influence it has. But one of the points that Fitzpatrick makes in terms of talking about reverse migration is that it is perceived as, and may also be very often, a product of failure. So these are people who went away to America to make it and didn't come back. So we kind of think of The Returned Yank, I think of The Queer Fellow. Is that the right film that I have in mind? Sort of coming back with money to buy land and so on. But the economic reality is a lot of these people came back having not made it and suffering adverse economic advances. Positions. We think of, for example, De Valera being returned as a child to be brought up by relatives. So I think by and large it's probably not. I think it's probably more convincing that people are coming back because they couldn't make it, I think, rather than a rejection of materialism. In terms of anti-modernism and it being kind of rhetorical rather than structures, I mean, that is a fair point to make about De Valera's constitution, and De Valera's constitution does have some legal implications which shape the state and shape power relations within the state. But I think a big criticism you could make of De Valera's constitution is that really it's a kind of triumph of rhetoric over reality. If you look at how it imagines an Ireland that consists of the island of Ireland, how it imagines an Irish-speaking Ireland, how it imagines the family, it's as if there's it's a transposition of De Valera's idea of the ideal Ireland, and everybody's very familiar with that speech with dancing at the crossroads. But it's almost as if, like, by putting this down on a document and calling it the Constitution, then that gives it a kind of a reality which it doesn't have. And it's kind of interesting in and he is obviously very influenced by priests, including Jesuits, in terms of the Catholic social thought that informs a lot of that document. But it's very interesting how there's a lot of criticism of the document, including by, political colleagues such as Sean Lemass, saying, well, you can't just make Catholic social thought the political structure of the state, and also you can't make what you would like to see as the kind of political reality by constitutionally enshrining it. So I think that's a weakness, and I'm quite convinced by Joe Lee's criticism of De Valera's constitution as really the problem not lying with the vision. The vision of a Catholic Gaelic Ireland was hugely popular in the 1930s, but by the failure to achieve that vision, and by really almost no real practical constructive attempt to address that problem. And it kind of ties in with the themes of this talk, because by substituting what you would like to see for what there is, I think it allows you to see how there is a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of self-deception, a lot of a kind of the self-perception of the Irish as being particularly Catholic and pure allowed you to ignore the reality of things like mass emigration and the treatment of children, high celibacy, and all the aspects of Irish society that were so problematic that we're still coming to terms with.
Thank you, Fergal. Since we only have about 5 minutes left on our live chat stream here, or live stream, let me turn to 2 questions that we have so far. So one is, at which point did such anxieties about morality, jazz music, etc., begin to subside?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I've been thinking about that lately. Interestingly, as soon as jazz arrives in Ireland, which is the end of the First World War, it's 1918, 1919, when you have, for example, like black Americans, very small numbers, playing in music bands, you have immediately a kind of a rhetoric of racism and moral anxiety around that. It really takes off in the 1930s. I think that's the period when so in the 20s you see a lot of panic about dance halls and dancing, but jazz as being a kind of a moral panic is more rooted in the 1930s.
So when does it begin to subside is the question.
And it
yes.
begins to subside very quickly from 1940s.
From 1940s,
onwards.
correct.
It is in effect banned from 2RN, the radio station, until the mid-1940s. But the very extremist kind of anti-jazz rhetoric begins to subside quickly from the 40s onwards.
Thank you. And here's one from a literary angle. So was modernist literature, of course, James Joyce has to be mentioned, also the target of anti-modern panic, or just more foreign filth?
One of the really interesting things about this moral legislation is that it has unintended consequences. So if you look at the debates around censorship of publications, politicians are very clear that it's not targeting serious literature. It's about pornography, obscene literature, muckraking newspapers and so on. But the effect of the legislation and the mechanism which is set up where any Catholic committee can forward an item which is then usually banned, means that it has a sort of a blanket effect. And you find that with a lot of the moral legislation, that what it ends up doing is not what it was supposed to do. So for example, with the jazz legislation, it ends up being a kind of a factor in repressing traditional dance and dance practices in rural Ireland.
Good. 2 more questions in about 3 minutes here, all right? So can you speak to the importance of events like the Mother and Child Scheme, represented resistance by some politicians and leaders to this attempted suppression of a turn to modernity?
So I think the significance of the Mother and Child Scheme is that it shows us really how Catholic power operated in the 20s and 30s, and that was not necessarily by the bishops or the church saying, this is what we want you to do, although occasionally they did do that, but usually they didn't. It was by the state making sure that everything they did was in accordance with Catholic social principles, and in the background, when they're bringing in new legislation, making sure that it's not something that's going to be a problem with the Catholic Church. So the significance of the Mother and Child Scheme is it's the first time you have a public or open disagreement between church and state, and that begins to bring in the oxygen of publicity. So really getting back to that idea of consensus, it's the consensus which makes Irish anti-modernity so pervasive and so powerful, that it's deep-rooted, not just in a church-state relationship, but in a sort of a broader social consensus, that of course these are the values we should be implementing.
Okay, good. So they keep coming in a little bit. Some of these, if we don't get to your question, by the way, in the chat, we can share them out afterward on the same site you've come back to, or our website, or you can email us at Burns Library at using our Ask Burns on our website. Easy to find, all right? So I'll take them in order. How critical were constitutional referenda?
Well, in this period, they weren't very critical. When they do become critical for social matters in the 1980s, what's really interesting is that the Catholic conservative side prevails in most of the important referendums. So again, it goes to that idea of modernity is always coming, but it comes so exceptionally late in Ireland.
Good. Thank you. And I think we're coming just to the very top of the hour here, and our live broadcast will end momentarily. So thank you to all of you who did join us online. We're pleased for that. And again, the chat questions, we know everybody who's asking questions here. Just email me, and we'll make sure we'll get those to Fergal, and then we will get them off to you. So signing off live from Burns Library. Look for other events on our website, bc.edu/Burns. And we're delighted, and thank you, Fergal, on behalf of all of us. And we'll continue a little conversation here in this room. But how about some applause for the audience out there?
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening in.